Hey guys, so for episode 52, I'm going to touch on Emily's question, which is about like zone 2, like aerobic capacity and that sort of stuff. So obviously a lot of you guys are into like your running and cycling, high rocks, all that sort of stuff. So this will be quite appropriate for a lot of you, and it does obviously apply to CrossFit as well. Firstly, I'll talk about a bit about the science behind it, and then what zone 2 training is, how it compares, and what high intensity interval training is, and also why it is different for men and women in terms of one may be more beneficial for men and the other may be more beneficial for females because of our physiological differences. In terms of these zones, so typically zone 2 was sort of called LSD, long slow distance, before anyone makes a joke. Zone 1 is sort of like your low, very low intensity, so 50% of your max heart rate, like going for a walk, for example. Zone 2 then is around that 60% upwards, maybe towards 70% of your max heart rate tops, something you can maintain a conversation at. Zone 3 onwards is like your 70% onwards tempo work, and it should start to feel challenging. Zone 4s and 5s are like your sort of your higher intensity levels. So zone 4, hard efforts, near your limit, not quite there, so like up to 90%, and then your zone 5 is all out sprint, maximum intensity, like 20-30 seconds sort of work, and then you would have to come back down and go back into like zone 1 and 2 to get the heart rate down, recover, and then go again. So like zone 2 is sort of like your engine, like building your base, and you've probably heard that before, like an aerobic base. So if you think about a house, like we always say, if you build big foundations, you can build a bigger house. It's like in a car, if you put a bigger engine in the car, you can tune it and it's going to be more efficient. So aerobic capacity, or maybe VO2 max you might have heard of, which is sort of maximum oxygen consumption. It's basically your body's ability to take in, transport and utilise oxygen. So taking it in the lungs, transport, circulatory system, and then utilise oxygen in muscular level. It's what helps you sustain effort, recover between sets, and handle volume, without essentially burning out. In CrossFit, even, during like our sprint type workouts, so like Fran, you do rely on an aerobic base to help you recover as quick as possible between those small little breaks you might have, and then repeat those efforts. So it's actually quite a good point I've just thought of in my head about those that avoid, aerobic training and cardiovascular work, metabolic conditioning work for like weightlifting. You're going to miss out because you're going to be unable to recover as quick as someone that is aerobically fit. For example, like Tia, she's the best, she's one of the best weightlifters, but aerobically she's also one of the best. That's why she usually wins pretty good, because she's able to recover between sets doing multiple reps during weightlifting. So avoid it at your peril, folks. Okay. So zone 2, what is it? Like I said, 60 to 70% of max heart rate work. It does and should be for at least durations of 45 to 60 minutes. Typically why people tend to do it on like stationary bikes or cycling. Stationary bikes are better because it's much more manageable in terms of the intensity. If you go out on the bike, it's obviously a bit more interval type with the hills. You can do it running. It's not as probably efficient because your running mechanics will change. So therefore you're going to be running probably a lot slower than you would normally, and that's probably not going to do you much good. But it is typically of durations of 60 to 120 minutes at a go. One of the main benefits of it is it improves what we call your mitochondrial density. So if you don't know what mitochondria are, they're your cell powerhouses. It's where everything takes place, from like energy metabolism, fat oxidation and that sort of stuff. So if you have bigger and more mitochondria, essentially you're fitter. It also helps with capillarization. So that goes back to my uni days. So more capillaries. Okay, if you have more capillaries, you can transport and utilize more oxygen. Again, makes you fitter. Gives you that bigger base, bigger engine. It can also enhance what we call insulin sensitivity. So, for example, diabetics are insulin resistant. or type 1 diabetics anyway. So if you're more sensitive to insulin, therefore you can sort of store and replenish glycogen more efficiently, and therefore you're going to again have more energy to then utilise in workouts rather than it just being sort of floating around the bloodstream. Talking about blood lactate as well, so zone 2, so 60-70% sits below your lactate threshold. So essentially, blood lactate starts to rise as we push intensities, and it will sort of cause fatigue. If you've got a graph, zone 2 is below, so your body can buffer the lactate that is produced as a byproduct from the exercise, and you can continue to do so as long as you provide it with energy, so food. So it sits below the first sort of lactate threshold, and training there teaches your body to clear blood lactate efficiently, and therefore you will push that threshold. So what was 70% will eventually become like 60%, and so on. And hence we call it building the base. In terms of that gender nuance I mentioned, so the difference between men and women, so typically us men are not as flexible metabolically in our mitochondria as you women, and we tend to gain more from zone 2 work, because zone 2 relies heavily on like fat oxidation pathways, and therefore it sees big improvements in our endurance. You ladies already typically have much more efficiency in metabolizing like fats thanks to estrogen. So yes, zone 2 is not going to do you any harm. However, is it optimal for like performance gains versus high intensity, especially for menopausal women? The jury is out. I should also add on that, if zone 2 work is your soul food, we call it, basically your feel good, then do it. Like, I'm never going to stop anyone wanting to do some form of exercise or activity if it makes you feel good, mentally, physically. I mean, for example, I love going out for a nice long run just for my headspace. Yes, if it might not be optimal in terms of performance, but I don't care because I enjoy it. Moving on to high intensity work. So high intensity interval training, short bursts of like near maximum effort with rest, and that rest can be anything from like a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, from like a 1-to-10 work to rest ratio. That does help also boost maximum oxygen consumption, so VO2 max, blood lactate clearance, power, your ability to tolerate and recover from intense periods of exercise. A good little analogy is thinking of it as like adding a turbocharger to your engine. So you've already got a massive engine, you've built that base, and now we're adding the turbochargers to help you perform, optimally, like during sort of sprint efforts, like acceleration, if you like. In terms of blood lactate, so high intensity training pushes you much nearer to what we call the lactate turn point. So that's where accumulation of lactate becomes more than what your body can clear. So that's why we then have to come back down during those rest periods, allow the body to clear the blood lactate, then you go again. And again, this also will push your thresholds further down the graph, so you can push harder without accumulating as much blood lactate. Training here proves, like I've said, about your ability to buffer the lactate, but also it's crucial for CrossFit workouts as well. So if we take like on the minute work, for example, like Tuesday's workout, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. That's typical of like a sort of interval training where you accumulate high levels of blood lactate, you have the rest period to try and buffer as much as you can, then you go again. In terms of that gender nuance, like we said, females typically show stronger adaptations to this kind of training because of the way your like mitochondria are already working. It improves obviously power output. That does cross over to your zone 2, so it does improve your aerobic base as well, but it's also due to like the hormonal differences and different types of muscle fibers that you recruit. Us men do benefit as well, but without a solid aerobic base, these repeated efforts will eventually lead to us, essentially hitting the wall and burning out. So that aerobic base is very, very important, more for men, but also just for women as well. How does this transfer over to CrossFit? That's a very good question from Emily there. So in CrossFit, we demand essentially fitness at all levels, and yes, we cannot be perfect at all of them. That's what the beauty of CrossFit is. We're a master of none. we need that base, we need that solid zone 2 aerobic base so we can handle volume, so we can recover if it's cardiovascular training, if it's weightlifting, if it's gymnastics. We also need to work in those higher top ends, so like your zone 4s and zone 5s, so we can then also do things like EMOM work. We can recover between high intense, say, barbell cycling. So the sort of takeaway here is that we need to be able to do both. You can't prioritize both, but if you do have a big base, then your likelihood is you're going to be able to do the other stuff better. So takeaways for the gender nuances, I would say men, if you don't have as great an aerobic base, you spend your time, in the top end stuff, or if, like, for example, during the programming, if all you chose was like the high intensity metcon stuff, then you're going to have that limitation of not having a solid base. Equally, if you do the other end, you're going to have a top end weakness. Again, ladies definitely include, the high intensity work for like postmenopausal women, but also, to improve power output, that sort of thing. But also, like I've said, if zone 2 work is your soul food, keep doing it, because it's far better to do it than not do it at all. In terms of the CrossFit transfer, again, remember CrossFit is constantly varied functional movements executed at high intensities, but intensity is relative and it's relevant to you, and that will change on the day depending on how you're feeling, if you've had a good night's sleep, etc. And sometimes the right intensity can be just taking it slow and steady, and then sometimes the right intensity can be top end, like really pushing that red line, but it has to be a balance. If you want to become an all-rounded athlete like we do as CrossFitters, then we program in a balanced way. Okay, you guys remember when we did the zone 2 erg? What was it, 40 minutes on the erg? I think Jack was saying I'm super brave to program that, because no one would ever program it, but the benefit of it is exactly what I've just spoken about for 12 minutes. Zone 2 builds your engine. The high intensity top end work adds turbochargers to a big engine. If you've got a massive engine, put a massive turbocharger in. If you've got a tiny little 1 litre, adding a little turbocharger is not going to make much of a difference. I hope that makes sense. But yes, so there's the two sort of differences. We need to do both, and if you enjoy one and not the other, try to not avoid the one you don't enjoy, because you can't have one without the other. I hope that makes sense. I will put out a poll on WhatsApp for the next couple of topics we'll cover in December. But otherwise, I hope that makes sense, folks. Any questions, please do let me know. And I'm sorry it's taken 13 minutes. But again, it was a bit of a sort of hark back to my uni days with all the science behind it. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in the gym soon.